on where anti-colonial political thought where it was for the last several decades, where we were, where we are now, what are the kind of questions animating it, what are the political contexts which give rise to it. And for that, we have four extraordinarily distinguished panelists with us here. And so I'm just going to introduce them very briefly, and because all of them, first of all, in some senses require no introduction, and in some senses have a very, very long body of work to talk about. So I'll keep it very, very short. And I'm just going to go in the order from our far left over there, which is Professor Chakravarty, who is a political theorist and intellectual historian, professor at the Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies at Columbia. His work is on Indian social and political thought across the 19th and 20th century, as well as Western social and political thought and its circulation and translation. Prior to joining Columbia, he taught at SOAS in London and JNU in India. He was also a fellow at St. Antony's College at Oxford. He has been a member of the Subaltern Studies Collective, and Chakravarty's books include, there are many, I'm just going to mention just a few, The Imaginary Institution of India, The Enchantment of Democracy, Trajectories of the Indian State, and The Invention of Private Life. Professor Elizabeth Pavanelli is France First Professor of Anthropology at Columbia University and the corresponding fellow of the Australian Academy for Humanities and one of the founding members of the Caribbean Film Collective. Professor Pavanelli's writings is focused on developing a critical theory of late liberalism that would support an anthropology of the otherwise. This potential theory has unfolded primarily from within a sustained relationship with Indigenous colleagues in North Australia and across 5 books, numerous essays, and 6 films with the Caribbean Film Collective. Recent publications include Geontologist, a requiem for late liberalism, and Between Gaia and Ground, 4 Axioms of Existence and Ancestral Catastrophe of Late Liberalism. Aida Hernandez Castillo is a professor and senior researcher at the Centro de, my apologies if I didn't pronounce it well, Centro de Investigación y Estudios Superiores en Antropologías Sociales, CIESAS, in Mexico City. She has combined her academic work with feminist activism and projects in radio, video, and journalism. Her academic work has promoted indigenous and women's rights in Latin America. Her research interests covers indigenous studies, legal and political anthropology, decolonial feminism, and activist research. Professor Hernandez Castillo is the author of Multiple Injustices, Indigenous Women, Law, and Political Struggle in Latin America, and the co-editor of Transcontinental Dialogues, Activist Alliances with Indigenous Peoples of Canada, Mexico, and Australia. Many other books. And then finally, Professor Mahmood Mamdani is the Herbert Lehman Professor of Government at Columbia University. He was Professor and Executive Director of Makerere Institute of Social Research in Kampala. He specializes in studies of colonialism, anti-colonialism, and decolonization. His work explores the intersection between politics and culture, a comparative study of colonialism, history of civil war and genocide in Africa, the Cold War and War on Terror, and the history and theory of human rights. Professor Mamdani is the author of Neither Settler Nor Native, The Making and Unmaking of Permanent Minorities, Saviors and Survivors, Darfur Politics and the War of Terror, Good Muslim, Bad Muslim, America, the Cold War and the Roots of Terror, When Victims Become Killers, Colonialism, Nativism, and Genocide in Rwanda, and Citizens and Subjects, Contemporary Africa and the Legacy of Late Colonialism. So thank you all of you for coming, being with us here, and for this conversation. So my role here is just prompt for a conversation, and I'll start with Professor Chakravarty in order. And so the first question was just to welcome to reflect on sort of the conditions of anti-colonial or decolonizing thought when you began your work. So what were the conditions then? What were the problems faced, the questions animating you, and then you can sort of think more about various things. So, Professor Chakravarty. We'll use the mic as well. So recording is.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm very glad to be part of this discussion, particularly because of the analysts who are sitting here. I thought of, I put down some notes. What I should do is I'll put some of these as we go down through the three rounds of discussion. I think one of the problems about thinking about the end of colonialism or anti-colonialism is that colonialism is such a vast, such comprehensive phenomenon of subjection of the lives of some societies by the lives of others, the structures of domination of others. That the question, what is anti-colonialism, is not easy to answer, particularly from an intellectual point of view. And so I think what I should do is I should actually try to focus on a question which I'm more competent to respond to. And for that, I think I'll put it historically. If you think of the end of colonization, it can mean three different things. And I think your conference itself reflects a rich variety of different types of theories which respond to those different types of theories. The first, the most obvious form of colonialism, of course, is the growth of political subject. And decolonization there means essentially end of political sovereignty of Europe. And I think that is something which was in some ways, historically, politically, the most difficult to achieve in one sense, not in every sense. But it is also something which is the most least problematic in some sense. But it is also clear that colonialism was not just about political side. At least another side of colonialism was the question of control of economic life and productive life of the society. I think liberal theory is essentially focused on the first question. Marxists generally focused on the second question, and I think they were creative about the second question. And third, people like Gandhi, who were not conventional political theories. In fact, in my own thinking, when I was very young, I was in college and university, I ignored Gandhi. I didn't think that Gandhi had very much to give. And I was much more attracted to different forms of Marxism, including experimental forms of Marxism in India. But I think Gandhi had an understanding of colonialism which was extremely radical, which said that even if you think that you have in some ways, if not overcome, come beyond, in some senses, political and economic colonialism, the question of cultural colonialism is still very much, it still remains. And it remains, but it's not a remainder in that sense. Actually, as one layer of colonialism recedes, the other layer, in a certain sense, becomes colonialism. I feel that within that, within cultural colonialism, my concern is much more with epistemic colonialism. Because I take that simply to be this, that if you take Orientalism to be a summary of the kind of world picture that was created by the rise of modern knowledge in modern Europe, the subjection of both the cognitive subjectivity and also the political imaginary of the colonial society to that, I think was one of the major questions of the epistemic colonialism. The question today would be, what does it mean to come out of that? And I'm actually both happy on the one side and slightly concerned at the frequency with which people come to the question of decolonizing knowledge. And so I wanted to turn our reflection to some extent to what the meaning of decolonization can be. And I'm going to suggest, I had a slightly longer note, but I'll simply finish with this very quickly. I personally feel that the process of decolonization cannot be a single process, simply because of the nature of colonialism. Because colonialism, for the first time in history, I think split the world into two. It is like actually breaking the world into two parts and separating them. connecting them to structures of colonialism and domination, but also separating them in terms of experience. Because I think the experience of modernity is radically different from what it was in the metropole and what it was in the colony. And so because of that, I think the question of decolonizing models must actually follow two very different trajectories. Do not misunderstand what I'm saying. I'm not saying that these two trajectories should not converge, but they are not the same. Sometimes they are also very different to bring into conversation. So let me make a very provocative point about India. That's only part of the world that I know. In India, when I grew up, let me put it very brutally, because of the structure of the educational system, English was supposed to be the language of people who thought, were able to think. And Bengali was supposed to be the language of people who can. Very clear. That doesn't mean that the Bengalis did not try in their own way to think. There was Tagore and there was a tradition after Tagore. But I think there was a radical split between these two types of epistemic approaches to the problems of modern history. So I propose that what we should do is, we should try to understand that these two agendas are very different. There is a post-colonizing cognitive agenda in the West. I think the West needs to think about the other parts of the world in ways which might be radically different from what is over there. But that is not necessarily the problem in India. And I wanted to make one last remark connected to what I said about English and India. If you take all forms of modern philosophical doctrine, they all see language as central. And I think they're all acknowledged in very different ways. It is language that discloses the world. Because without language, the world is closed. And it is language which literally, in this sense, literally, discloses the world. But there is no sort of generally common universal human language. Every language discloses the world in different ways to us. And so therefore, I think the important thing in decolonization of knowledge, epistemic decolonization, in India, for instance, I think, is to look at how modern Indian thinkers, like Gandhi, Tagore, and others who wrote in the vernacular thought about colonialism, reflected on what was the meaning of decolonization, and also tried to do it in the vernacular languages of India. Otherwise, we'll get into a situation where the West would try to teach the knowledge how to decolonize itself. And I don't think there can be anything which is more
Happiness. What's going to be quite hard is not to start a conversation so quickly. Hey, that was really interesting. The spirit is, how did we get into this game, and what was it when we arrived? I think for me, it's particularly important. Perhaps the peculiar way, perhaps not way that I entered into the academy as such. And what I entered with when I entered into the academy. So very, in a nutshell, summary way, the impetus to go to graduate school came from two generations of my generation, of Indigenous women and men that I met in 1984. And I met them when after I got out of St. John's College in Santa Fe, which is a great books program, but situated in very specific social setting. And he met this generation coming from a family, Povinelli, my father's side family, who came from a little village in the Alps. And it wasn't a little, it is a little village in the Alps. But it's within a region, Tyrol, Trentino, that had this 800-year commons tradition. So 1027 to Napoleon, these little villages were given semi-autonomous right to just make the rules for how they use their commons. Precarious, not wealthy. So Povinelli, as such, emerged in like 1480s. This little guy, Bartolomeo. Poigna Eli, the little ricotta cheese god. And comes to be a surname, and then is split into clans, Scotum in dialect. And it was very important when we were small that we really understood that we were from Gorizou. It was like, we don't even know where it is. So I'm raised in Louisiana. We moved to Shreveport in 1965, so it's Voting Rights Act, Civil Rights Act, father side family, really getting us to understand that we had this particular way of belonging somewhere else that was not national, was not ethnic, was not, etc. And I arrived at LU in a small indigenous community, and so I'd never heard anyone outside my family talk about relating to place in the way they did. But at that moment, and this is where that moment, two things happened. It was like, wow, and they were like, what? No, white people have nations. Are you Italian? Are you American? Right, so this conversation. But the second thing that happened that determined the reason I'm in the academy and what I do in the academy in relation to decolonial practice or theory is that they said, well, if you're from this place, why are you here? And second, why are we like we are? And your family sounds like what they are, i.e., let's say we were both dispossessed. Because in my white family, Napoleon dispossessed us, right? We were both dispossessed. But in 1984, it was very clear when we first met that dispossession is not a singularity, it's a relation. We were, now Eileen Warrington Robinson, we were dispossessed, absolutely, into possessive individualism. And my colleagues in Australia were dispossessed with intentions that were much more radical about genocide elimination. So that relation, which has nothing to do with the academy, conditioned my entrance into it and the way I think. And they said, they were involved in a land rights claim. They were claiming over their land. And by law in Australia, I've written about this, they could not represent their own voice. They had to have a lawyer or an anthropologist. And an anthropologist. And they said, be a lawyer. You're not to put that. Be a lawyer. If you want to be a lawyer, they said, be an anthropologist. And I said, I don't know what that is. White people studying us. Okay, so it's these are very sophisticated people. And I said, really, I don't want to do that. They said, no, we want you alongside to try and understand in Creole government. Like, they say this, they do that. How do we come to understand the structure of governance? And so the turning of analysis onto a form, or what for me later a periodization of settler liberalism really was initiated by them. And so my entrance into conversations in the academy were authored by that. And indeed, I think that's all I've ever done in all of that work. But I just want to say, because I know probably already I'm over the limit, I just want to say two other things that the kind of the basement of why I'm even here, what I still feel obligated to abide by is, first of all, if we're trying to build concepts in decolonization, whatever the concept is, for me, in this relation, the question is, where do they come from? And what are they meant to do? Concepts come from somewhere, right? So, way down the line when I'm doing geontopatology. That concept comes from 40 years, it's 40 years now, 40 years of, doing all kinds of things with my colleagues. So it comes from here. It's apparent here that there's this form of geontopatology. It's been apparent for a long time. I mean, do rocks list? I mean, it's just been apparent. What's the purpose of a concept? For me, but also from an ethics of relationality that, I've learned there. The concept isn't, the use of the concept is not to create a new universal or something that functions kind of similar to it. That is, a concept as something that applies to everything, everywhere, and thus to no one, nowhere. And again, Vine Deloria Jr., just rule of thumb, it's like in God is Read in Revelation, where he makes a bit of white revelation, native revelation. The revelation comes to what he would say, Europeans, and they think it applies to everyone and everywhere. And they demand, they go and tell you about it, but they're really demanding that you abide by it. Versus what he talks about is adjustment. Right? And I think that's, for me at least, very close to what a Bellion-Cotabing way of thinking about concept work does. It's, well, here, this concept's doing work. Could be decolonization, post-colonialism, etc., geontopower. The world started getting tangled as the boats invaded across the oceans. But one can't assume that the concept will do the work across these various forms of entanglement that it does here. And that's where, and I'll stop here, I know the world is divided in two, but it seems that the way in which lands and peoples were entangled as these boats go across and start justifying the sadistic extractions makes a very makes a more entangled problematic. And I think some of the conversations in indigenous and subaltern studies, indigenous black studies are trying to figure this out.
Well, thank you very much. It's very inspiring to be here discussing these topics, especially now that we're living this genocide, we call it genocide, and to be a Mexican in Harvard that has studied in such a colonial way the reality of indigenous people in Mexico has been a paradox, a very contradictory feeling. So I'm very glad to be able to be here now and having and more inspiration about what resistance and what a struggle for justice is about. And I want to start by saying that the geopolitics of knowledge has marked a lot my trajectory of how do I approach the discussion on decolonization, anti-colonialism. I was formed in the National School of Anthropology, that is a school that was very influenced by the move in Mexico City, by the movement of the 60s. So it was a very Marxist school. I have 7 seminaries of the capital, 1 entire seminary as Acumulación Originaria. And so yesterday's panel on the Bolsheviks was it really reminded me of the good old times at the ENA. And in that moment, the discussion on internal colonialism with the work of Pablo González Casanova was very important for all of us. And it was a perspective that put in the center, influenced by the dependency theory, of course, the relation between center and periphery. But it was very, very, in his first writing, he went back to his writing later in his life. He was a political economy perspective of unequal economic relationship between center and periphery. But at the same time that González Casanova was writing about this political economic relationship in which indigenous peoples, and then Rodolfo Stavenhagen also developed this idea more specific with indigenous peoples and peasants, there were other things being theorizing from another kind of text. And I was 19-year-old when I got close to the revolutionary movement in Guatemala, because we have an Guatemalan exile in Mexico. And the ORPAN, the Organización Revolucionaria del Pueblo en Armas, the Revolutionary Organization of Peoples in Arms, was one of the first guerrilla movements to theorize on racism. They have 2 texts that were clandestine texts that were called Racismo Uno y Racismo Dos, Racism 1 and Racism 2. Because it was one of the first guerrilla movements that was questioning the Marxist perspective on indigeneity and rural peasants. And I was working in a Guatemalan press agency called Infoprensa. I always say that I owe more to Infoprensa because I learned to write and I make my living by doing writing than to Stanford when I got my PhD. And also because I was formed politically in this framework. And what I discovered by reading Racismo Uno and Racismo Dos, that we have to read it to be part of this press agency, it was that theorization is also taking place outside the academia through different languages that are not always recognized, and that many times scholars appropriate as testimonies, as texts to be analyzed, but they don't take it seriously as theorizations about the world. And I think that one of the first things that I do, because I teach a class now in a PhD program that is called Decolonizing Theory, is to include in that class all these different political texts that were theorizing colonialism as a structure way before Walter Mignolo, Aníbal Quijano, and all these other people started to theorize. So the first thing that I realized with this also is that when Latin American theories are being heard, is because they come to the States and they bring some of those theories from Latin America back to the States, they reframe it in English, and they bring it back to, and those are the ones that are then quoted. And I don't know if some of you that are read Spanish know this huge debate between Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui and Walter Mignolo, in which he says, like, you're appropriating my theory and quoting me just a certain text, and this is part of the epistemic colonialism that we're rejecting. So I think that one first thing is that I invite the Anglo-Saxon academia to read in Spanish and in other languages where also theories taking place, because we're still being seen as a place to do field work. So people go to Latin America to do field work and then theorize the field work with the theories of the North, and they barely discuss what is being discussed from the theoretical perspective. So I see Mary Pratt here, that the Spanish departments in the US universities are the ones that are debating the discussions in Latin America more than the anthropology department or other kind of departments. No. Okay, I'm sorry. So I want to say, so after that, González Casanova book, Carlos Guzmán Bocler, a Guatemalan anthropologist, wrote a book that is called Colonialismo y Revolución, Colonialism and Revolution. That is barely quoted, and we're talking about the 70s, in which he talks about this colonial structure that in Guatemala is very evident, that we cannot understand the class struggle without recognizing the continuity of the colonial project. But these kind of debates were seen in the Mexican context as something that we'll be discussing Guatemala, where the national project was a segregationist project. But the myth of mestizaje in Mexico, that has been so powerful as a national myth, had made more difficult to analyze the importance of racism as a structure in a relationship. I mean, just to simplify, the post-revolutionary discourse says that in Mexico we are all mestizos, we have all indigenous backgrounds, so because of that, we are not racist, because we are mestizos, so you will not be racist with your own origin. So racism is a problem that can be experienced in the north, in the US, or in Guatemala, where they have this colonial structure. But we have a Mexican Revolution, so we are not, the problem of the colonial structure was dealt by the. So it has been very difficult to put this debate in the center. And that's where the Zapatista rebellion have played such an important role, not only politically, but theoretically. In 1994, rebellion happened, the issue of racism was in the center of the debate for the first time in the history of academia. Just as an example, the Harvard Chiapas Project was in Chiapas for more than 50 years. And they published this book like this, of all the dissertations, articles that they have. There is not one about racism in a colonial context like San Cristobal, in which when the Harvard Chiapas Project was there, indigenous people cannot walk in the sidewalks. They have to leave the sidewalks if a non-indigenous person was walking. And none of the scholars wrote a word about racism, and the Mexican scholars either. So the Zapatistas were very important in that terms to put, even when it's right, what Gustavo said yesterday, that at the beginning it was a nationalistic project, the flag, Mexican flag went up and down. It developed with the time with a very strong critique of the uses of nationalism as a colonial project. And just to close and leave something for the next question, when I went to Chiapas in 1993 to do my dissertation research, I did my dissertation on a Maya people that were divided by the border, and it was a strong critique of the national project as a colonial project, how the violence of borders in the Mam people. And in that moment, when I saw the flag going up and down in the Zapatista area, because the Mams are in the border, I was kind of surprised, because for the Mam people, the flag didn't mean the same thing that in other areas, because the nationalization of the border was very violent. They wanted them to make it clear who was Mexican and who wasn't. So their language was prohibited. Talking about language, the Mam language was prohibited. Their traditional clothing was burned in the middle of the villages. And the socialist government of post-revolutionary government of Cárdenas distribute jean overalls, so to represent the working class, and their traditional clothing was burned because it was of colonial origin. So what it implied, all this nationalistic violence for them, it really marked my perspective on what is the future of the national project that is invaded with this coloniality. So just to think in the three concepts that are here, we always say that descolonizar es un verbo, anticolonial es un adjetivo, y poscolonial un anhelo. So just to say that to decolonize is a verb, to be anti-colonial is an adjective, adjective, and post-coloniality is only an horizon.
Thank you. I'm happy to enter into a conversation with my colleagues. And at the heart of the conversation is this notion of indigenous, which is being strongly realized, as I hear. I think we had a similar attitude to the time of independence in Africa, 60s, 70s. Now that we were independent, we were going to govern ourselves. And the only violence that was likely to be was the violence of revolution and counter-revolution. Otherwise, we have left the question of violence behind us. Almost everybody accepted this as gospel truth. And then came the Rwanda genocide, 1994. What are called the genocidaires now, the Hutu, claim to be indigenous. And they had decimated the settlers. Tutsi would come from outside. This is the beginning of a big question for us, with which we continue to wrestle, Fed by a distrust and a suspicion about indigeneity. Down which path are we going with this notion? I taught at I directed and taught at the Nuclear Institute of Social Research about 12 years. Set up the first interdisciplinary PhD program, and taught a course on colonialism and post-colonialism. And we read anti-colonial intellectuals. One of these was Gandhi. And we read Gandhi's text. What was it called? The first text that he wrote from his work. So we read his work. The students were struck by Gandhi's irreverence to both modernity and to nationalism. Gandhi warned, we may get rid of the British, but we will become the new British. So at one point I asked my students, I said, is there anything modern about Gandhi? And toward the end of the course, we came to a consensus that Gandhi had swallowed hook, line, and sinker the notion of the nation. Gandhi claimed that India had been a nation from before the British came. Gandhi claimed that India had been a nation before the modern era. And we asked ourselves, What did Gandhi understand by nation? Gandhi understood by nation the Hindu nation. Gandhi understood that Muslims were immigrants and we Hindus must be hospitable and nice to Muslims. But Gandhi never confronted the fact that the vast majority of Muslims were converts. So what kind of a nation is this? Then the students read about the partition in India. Against this ever-present specter, Rwanda. And many of them began to suggest that we must think of the partition as an indigenous genocide. And we must think of Rwanda as an indigenous genocide. And we must think of both of them as subaltern genocide. And they began to be suspicious of the School of Subaltern Studies and its romanticization of the native and of the indigenous. There were no conclusive answers, but these are the kinds of questions that were arising. I suggested to them that, we must think of indigeneity not just as global. We must think of indigeneity, we must consider the possibility that indigeneity is valorized where settler and native have become central constructs. And that is in the New World. That is in the New World. Everywhere else, what is common is not the construction of a state which valorizes the settler and devalorizes the native. We must consider the settler experience as different from the migrant experience. The migrant does not have a political project to create their own state. Anyway, this led us into other horizons. But it's not just accidental that the one place where indigeneity was not valorized, it was valorized, but not supremely valorized, was South Africa. That the South African political project had in it room for the settler. It raises a very interesting question. It's not just about Mandela selling out his people. I read a series of essays in publication last week. Steve Biko said, black is not a color. Black is an experience. If you're oppressed, you're black. Mind-blowing. So I just want to put this before my dear colleagues and say, let's rethink indigeneity. Let's think of a world beyond indigeneity.
Thank you. And it's always a conversation ongoing, and I think my prompts feel a bit superfluous. I don't know if it's correct or not, but for now I'll do that because, but just, feel free to respond to the conversation questions going around, but just to kind of move the this panel forward. the second round of questions is really about thinking in terms of where you think these, I think we already started talking about it already, where you think these questions are today, right? What are some animating or interesting questions? Today, I think the presupposition was sort of contrasted to where you began, but you don't necessarily have to. But I think in terms of what does it mean today to do anti-colonial or decolonizing political thought, and what are some of the newer questions which arise and come up today in its current historical context. So,
Oh,
I must say, one point to what Rahul said. I don't think I read only that way. I thought we should not get into a discussion about language. But very briefly, I thought that the interesting thing, Indian nationalism, I think, was split between three different ways of thinking about the nation. One is a kind of modernist, secular way of thinking about the nation, represented by Nehru, the socialist communist. And separate from that, I would not always say opposed to that. If you use the term opposed loosely, then you can say that. But separated from that were two ways of thinking about the nation through religious experience, one of which fitted the description that you gave of Gandhi. But I think that fits Savarkar much more closely than that, at least in my view. And in my reading, the attractive thing about Gandhi and de Gaulle was that their argument was that in India, nationalism means two very different things. And the one is, the first meaning of nationalism is anti-imperialism, that we should get the British out of this country. That is one meaning of nationalism. The other meaning of nationalism, which always shadows it, which always sort of walks in it, walks behind it in a sense, for both of them, was the idea that once we have thrown the British out of India, we should become a nation in the sense in which the European nations are nations, which are homogeneous, a single people kind of nation. And I think both Gandhi and de Gaulle opposed the idea of the second kind of nationalism. I think my reading of Gandhi is quite different. But coming back, I agree with the rest of what you're arguing. So I think there are two separate parts. There's the theoretical argumentative structure where I think we and there's probably a more minor question of how you read Gandhi. Well, yeah. So I'll simply add a couple of things from the notes that I had. I think, let me put it this way, again slightly controversially. If we read Said, I now feel that there's something in Said's book which is very paradoxical. It is said that if you think of the section which is called Orientalism now, it's very powerful. It makes a case which from one point of view seems to be extremely powerful and plausible. From another point of view, I see myself as a historicist. It seems less plausible. The title of that section is Orientalism Now. And the implication is that what we have read in the previous part of the book, the structure of thought that we call Orientalism, we think that it's a great pity that even today, he's writing in 78, but let's extend that a little and think that even today, with that form of thinking about the norms still exists in the West. I think that is implausible in this sense, that all large groups of human beings and civilizations, they cannot but learn from history. The learning from history is not an option. I think if you live in history, you have to learn from history in your own way, not in a morally uplifting way, but in a kind of slyness of living with the everyday in history, which forces it. And so my argument would be that we should rethink the question of what is the end of colonialism, colonization. The simple reason that the end of British Empire, I think, did not signal the end of empire. And European imperial power has been replaced by an imperial reach of an American culture, which also had very strong epistemic culture. And so I told you earlier, what is the problem of this? That if you produce a completely monochromatic epistemic culture of the whole world, which simply reflects and echoes back to the American academia, what you think, I don't think that would be a decolonization of the world. Not really that way. The reason I mentioned the question of language, I think this is a deep historical, a deep theoretical, philosophical point for me, that experience must be different. Even today, the experience of history, living in the moment, must be fundamentally, profoundly different from the experience of living in the West. And it's mediated through the language. It's not surprising that a natural language, like the one you're thinking, works through a conceptual language, which is very different from the conceptual language that popular computer. So this is the first point. So I think this change from empire to empire is not a shift from one empire to another, but the conditions of what is material remaining unchanged. It is different. Empire has to be quite different in a politically decolonized world. So I now detect an interesting paradox inside both. The major part of the argument, I think, is fine, but the final part, Orientalism now, I think needs to be altered. Under our conditions, Orientalism that dominated the colonial world in the 19th century cannot work any longer. I don't think it does without profound internal alteration. And American dominance today is not a replay of European domination of the 19th and 20th century. It does not use political power in the same way. And this is something that I think we should tell ourselves, that soft power has the wonderful quality of allowing the dominant, the person who uses that power, to think that they do not have power. And the subjection of others to the direction of their thinking is due purely to the power of pure ego. So I think we must understand the conditions under which we live and think of it. And so this is something which I wanted to add to the discussion. And I feel, equally to some extent, the question about indigenous people's sense, not only of the past, but also of the present. That's why I see the post-colonial as such a powerful phrase, because it seems to me to capture two things. The idea that we live in a period which is in a certain limit after the overt political domination of Europe. But post-colonial also means, this is why earlier I was slightly unwilling to use the term post-colonial when I refer to it. But I now do that very happily and quite systematically, because I want to hold on to the other meaning of the post-colonial. That what happens now could not have happened this way had it not been because of the actual specific experience of colonialism. But the post-colonial is also, in one sense, the after of colonialism activity. But the historical consequences, which are still happening, and there is no after to that thing. And I like the term post-colonial, because post-colonial factors are both sides.
That's interesting. Yeah, of course.
I just wanted to add something to the introduction that Romy was, which was too generous. I want to partly repudiate that. So I wanted to add something. During COVID, driven by these kinds of thinking, I initially wrote 2 or 3 essays for a journal of, communist, nationalized communist Marxists in Bengali. And ultimately it turned into a big book. It's 500-page book, which is called Marx, In Bangla it's called Marx or Shogir Shanghar. In English that means Marx and the search for paradise. So I think this is something, search for paradise. And so, this is the way I think I have tried to respond to what I think now about the question of portfolio.
So I guess we got to talk again. Follow up. I'm going to hook out. I in many ways, of course, anyone working in, we often say, if there is an indigenous critical theory, anyone working there would agree with you that the deployment of indigeneity and the ongoing deployment of indigeneity was a invasion logic. An invasion logic in which here a kind of division opens up between the settler and the indigenous. And with that, and again, it's such a long conversation that's been had over this. The governance of the prior is a phrase we've used for many, many years, in which the indigenous comes to be structured as that which is before, which then allows a certain kind of invasion logic to proceed. And the way in which the governance of the prior, from a European invasion point of view, can operate as a form of governance can shift all over the place, right? So you can use it in an extermination mode, you can use it in a mode of liberal recognition, and etc. And I think that, what my work's been interested, the early work was interested in a kind of double movement in which the invasion creates the indigenous in relation to the settler, creates a temporal order, the prior and the post of invasion, right? And then governs around that. So say when Europe and the European diaspora is forced by the new left, by non-aligned, this is the 50s, and Sylvia Wynter, so many people, the 50s, it's really effective. There's a global, once again, assault on a certain kind of justification of liberal capital colonialism and imperialism, and pulls the face off of paternalistic colonial imperialism. And so what do we get? Oh, the kind of emergence of what I call late liberalism. That is a shift in the governance of difference and the shift in the governance of markets, but the shift in the governance of difference maintains the temporal logic of the governance of prior. It just shifts the value structure, but it's still demanding of those who were invaded that they present themselves in some relation to the before of the invasion. So, absolutely, of course, right? And I think what we're seeing now, what is happening now, the effectiveness of anti-white supremacy and the decolonizing methodology has been so effective that we see a shift in European, it's not a good shift, but European understandings of indigeneity in relation to themselves. So if the value is to be indigenous, then what we see on the right, both in the U.S., it manifests itself in different places. On the right in the U.S., you get that hard, proud boy, fuck you, we have a culture, white power. You get in Europe, all over the place now, and there's a left and a right version of this. We now, the good version is, we realize that we shouldn't appropriate other people's culture and epistemologies because we had our own. We also have our indigenous traditions. And so the kind of the good on the left is like looking down. So the same radici in Italian, the radici structure, right? Or indigeneity is a root. So we just look what we had before that, right? So it's looking down now. So I agree with all that. That is a structure of war that I don't think, I think it then moved as a political imaginary to other places. And as a structure of war, no one wants indigeneity. But I think we have to make a very hard distinction between that structure of war, this political imaginary discourse that arose from a settler point of view, and the actual struggles of indigenous people say, that's never been what we've been talking about, ever. It's not a radicity, it's not a root relation, it's a relation of routes, of adjustment, of absorption, really. And again, adjustment, right? And there are beautiful books by First Nation scholars, Native Americans, all talking about re-looking at the way in which, say, in upstate, the way in which different peoples who were driven violently out of the East came to be absorbed and moved into a new kind of federation. Right? So, and if you look at, if you read people like Zoe Todd, so many people, always the emphasis on the ancestral present. And this is also true in Australia and Canada. The ancestral ongoingness, which is not a relation to first or second. It starts in, how do we maintain a ethical relation to these lands nowish, hereish, who will stand side by side as an ally, right? Not a leader, not a do-no-but nothing, and help maintain that relationship. So I think I guess I go back to maybe the spirit of what you're suggesting. If you really listen to what people are doing rather than, the deployment of this war machine, the indigenous as a war machine, I think a very different landscape opens up.
It's a conversation. It's just a conversation. Well, I think that I totally agree with Dr. Povinelli's perspective. Anthropologists have been dealing with this indigeneity paradigm. I was just telling Carlos that they invited me to the Handbook of Identities, and I did a chapter on indigeneity, and it was called Indigeneity as a Field of Power. And when I started working in the Maya area in Mexico, I was going there with this historical constructivist perspective. I wanted to deconstruct how Mam people start to become indigenous. When did they appropriate the concept? Because there was a time in which they defined themselves only as peasants, and they start to define themselves as indigenous, and it has to do a lot with the state policies. But so I was very critical of the framework of indigeneity. So my path had been in the opposite direction of the path of your students, Mr. Mahmoud, because I started by criticizing, and then with the Zapatista movement, I started to see why it was politically relevant for those people to use that framework, and not to mobilize as Mames, Celtales, Navajos, Apaches, why they wanted to create this continental alliance under the framework of indigeneity. What was being used, what was being left. And I could say now, thinking in this Vico expression, Black is not a color, it's an experience. What I see is that being indigenous is not an origin, it's an experience. Because what I see is that it's a very flexible identity in which Afro-American people are part of this. People that do not speak an indigenous language anymore are also, this, as said by the Zapatistas, un mundo donde quepan muchos mundos, a world where many worlds can enter, has been created. So many times are the scholars, the ones that have a very essentialist perspective of what being indigenous is, but in the political movement is a much more open framework. And there are many examples. The Enlace Continental de Mujeres Indígenas, the Continental Network of Indigenous Women, has women from Alaska to the Patagonia, and they're struggling against mining, for example. So it could be said, well, why don't they just struggle as a woman against mining? Why do they want to use the framework of indigeneity, of indigenous women? And I think that there is a political connection, is not a strategy, but how to denounce the colonial dispossession, and who enters and who doesn't enter in this. It depends a lot of the political history of this. For example, Eloisa Tamés is an Apache Lipan woman who sued the US state for dividing her land with a border wall. And it's the only case in which the state of the United States have been taken to the Inter-American Court because of the division of the indigenous land. And in this case, she made her house in a village called Calabozo, that is interesting, Calabozo, the name, a welcoming space for migrants. So it's very interesting because although the mobilization discourse is on indigeneity as an Apache Lipan, and she's using the legal framework of territorial control, she's opening her house for immigration. So now it's a community center in which immigrants can stop. It's in Texas, in the border with Tamaulipas. So I think, I mean, I know that there is a lot of dangers with a lot of the identity politics. We can say the same thing about women's mobilization, and Judith Butler have been saying how the concept of woman is problematic. But we have to put each of these concepts in the context of the political struggle, how those concepts are being used, what is being included. And what I see now, and well, my reference is always the Zapatistas. I didn't say that in my CV, but I was part, since the 1994, of the people that were advised to the peace talks by the Zapatistas. We were invited to participate in these spaces. So I have been learning a lot of the way they're conceptualizing, changing their conceptualizations. For example, the last declarations, they are talking about the common. How can we build this common without having property over the land in the autonomic regions? And the call that they are doing when they went to Europe to contact different collective projects there is a very open conceptions of a struggle. So I think that in each of these concepts, there are always, each of mobilizing as women, as Afro-American, as people of color, all of this has a double edge. It's always there that can be used in different contexts, but we also have to see how people on the ground are using those concepts and giving different meanings. And I just want to close with a huge dilemma that I have coming from this historical constructivist analysis, and it has to do with the ontological term in anthropology. And the huge dilemma between ethnocentrism and Orientalism. So how can we be able to listen to other conceptions of understanding the self and the people without without constructing this otherness that makes very difficult any kind of dialogues of knowledge. So I don't have a solution. I think we have to be open to other ways of understanding the self and the world, but at the same time, not to close the possibility of having dialogues of knowledge that allow us to build political alliance to build a better world.
I'm not allowed to clap.
I guess at this point we should stand up and embrace one another. Chairperson, I think I had informed you earlier that I have a commitment which I cannot be late. So I both apologize and thank you. But I think we have the subject for your next conference. I just want to say one thing about Felipe is not here, but he had begun by sort of classifying the economic, political, and cultural. And at least the way I understand it, the African conversation is very much focused on the political imaginary, not really on the culture. It has to do with a lot of historically specific factors, which is that most African countries, the language of communication, including state communication, but also public discourse, remains a colonial language, except for Ethiopia, Sudan, and Africa. Most of Africa, it remains a colonial language. It's a question answer. It was a debate which was raised by the negritude scholars, but never really went beyond the Francophone. Thank you very much.
Professor Mondani, you must let me give you one anecdote about South Africa. The group that applied to the UN during the whole, I'm doing a little apartheid, the group that applied to the UN for status as indigenous in the African
I know, of course, because
Confirms
they wanted
what you're saying,
they
there was a
wanted
part
a
of
homeland.
decolonizing.
No, but the others had homelands. The homelands remained
Yes.
after
Yes.
1994,
Exactly.
Bantustans. Afrikaners didn't have a Bantustan. They wanted it.
Well, thank you.
We have another round of prompts. I think I'm very aware of the time, and then I can see a lot of people who want to have questions. So I think it's more productive if we just open it up for a conversation and have people also ask questions. So I mean, if you want to sort of respond to anything, or we can sort of take questions from the floor. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So we'll open the question to the floor. Like we've done the other instances, we'll collect a few questions at a time and then sort of have it have the panelists respond. Yeah. Somebody can do
Thank you. Thank you. Clap, clap, clap. I just have a question around indigeneity again. You discussed it as a political strategy, and you discussed it as an assertion of a particular way of being in the world, right? Like in terms of relationality.
Oh, I don't, yeah,
But maybe
that's fine.
you did it. Sorry. But what I heard was that indigeneity still has some valence because there is a particular way of thinking and being in the world that corresponds to what people are actually doing, that see themselves in this way, right? But I think that, like, first of all, if it's a political choice, then it's a choice, and there's other choices to be made, right? So the question is, what political work does the claim to indigeneity do, right? And what I see on the ground is the way that indigeneity is being mobilized by the same people who are also talking about it as a relational practice, is also territorial sovereignty, right? And it is also about political membership, and both of those ways of seeing the world, right? The claim to territorial sovereignty and the claim to determining political membership are exclusionary terms. They're not about standing side by side with one another, right? There is, if it's not a firstness and a secondness in relationship to time, it's a firstness and secondness in relationship to power, right? So I'm just wondering how, it seems to me, Professor Pavanelli, that the way that you're talking about it is very selective, and kind of doesn't deal with that politics. And in particular, one last thing is that the way that I see it being used on the ground by people who are saying that, they are not trying to reproduce power, but they're trying to reproduce this much more kind of relational approach to life, is this discourse of settler colonialism, right? Both in Canada and the United States, Indigenous activists who identify as anarchists or as revolutionaries, certainly anti-colonial, also say that if you're not Native, you're a settler colonist, And that is an incredible violence, both to the understanding of what colonialism is, but it's an incredible violence to the politics of standing side by side. Right?
We collect three questions. So we collect three questions at a time, and then we. I think Vanessa was next. Please raise your hand, and I'll take down your name.
Thank you so much. This is truly thought-provoking and generative. I actually have two questions. One refers to maybe how can we move towards a more complexified picture of colonialism instead of understanding it as just a kind of breaking into two, right? Because I do think the experience even within the West, when we think of Roma people, when we think about the continuities of the Ottoman Empire, when we think about the Kurdish struggle, then I think this kind of binary doesn't really work in terms of, because you also said it, right? Colonialism not being a unitary project, but a very complex hydra. And that also produces an experience even within the West that is also shaped by colonial modalities and the hierarchization of exploitation. And I think here I want to, yes, bring also the economic back in, because I do think what was raised with regards to political blackness, and I think it's not just a South African case, it's also what we know with regards to the struggle in Britain, as well as Haiti, right, as a kind of political black project in terms of the struggle also of Polish land workers, other people that were maybe would also be considered settlers. And I think that problematizes also a bit our conception of the settler in the sense of how Eric Williams thought about it. So that colonial capitalism moves people all the time. And so I'm wondering also in the sense of maybe also Paul Gilroy, thinking with Fanon and others, what would it mean? I'm not too fond of the whole universalism discussion, but I think there's something politically important in that with regards of moving towards a radical universalism from below, or something that is attended to a political project and not to the reformulation of an identity.
Andreas,
maybe that's sufficient for
we
now.
take two? No? Okay, all right. I think we can have a round of responses.
Thank you. Thank you. It's interesting. I agree. in deep ways, I agree. The way I come into this really does shape how I think about the political imaginaries, their effect on the distribution of crudely economic values, and how I answer the question of territoriality, which is essential. Absolutely. It's in some ways seems to be the unmovable ground. So territoriality as a kind of unmovable ground to the really, I think, rich, unresolved discussions between, again, we use these words, so indigenous, subaltern, black studies, conversations people are having. And started having in Illinois. I mean, I remember when Jody Byrd started the conversation in some ways, right? And I don't think the question of territoriality is resolved. I think it can be weaponized. I think there are a lot of folks who, like, you're not, therefore you're a settler. That's why when I started, I didn't start with indigenous and settler. And in the work I'm doing now, but we're doing, Cotabang's doing. We don't start with indigenous settler, we start with various forms of dispossession as relational. And trying to map out the complicated insertions of people being moved around in different structures of violence in order to extract economic value. So if we start, I mean, this is my mood going, you know, I'm gonna put indigenous on the hook. We're all gonna bite it. But if we start with the question of dispossession, it's very different the kinds of conversations you have. I think it doesn't resolve the problem, but I think it shows us the complexity of the problem. So, for instance, I start with, you know, white family, European family in the Alps, which had a commons tradition, but is not common. I'm going to come back to that in a second. It's a commons tradition. It was not individuals. It was obligation. If you read these charters, it's like you will. It was vicini based. It was family based. There were vicini in I forestieri, strangers, right? And the more that these things ramped up from 1027 to Napoleon, the more the bonds of relationality, even in Europe, were severed. And if you go into the archives and read these litigations, you hear people going, what is happening to us? Okay. So territory, absolutely. If, though, I start with dispossession, I think, okay, but what do I do with the fact that certain forms of dispossession, certain people were dispossessed into this kind of relation versus that kind of relation. That kind of relation allowed you to, I mean, it's a crude phrase, but take advantage of a different kind of dispossession. So my family could go to Buffalo in the turn of the century. They went because they were poor. We'd class them up poor. Had been turned into proletariats. But they could go. Right? Are they a settler? Just, how do I think about that relation of dispossession, the obligations it puts on me or others to think about where I put my work? So I put my work alongside carving because it's not about my identity, it's about relationality. But it is true, I do foreground that they should be the ones who decide about how people are included. But even there, what they struggle against is that they have been territorialized. And that's not how they did relations of land. So I just think we need to start, because dispossession as a radical relationality is kind of a glissant boat. Is not about identity politics. It's about, I think it's about something else. That's all I would say. No, I can't do it. I can't go to, sorry, I can't go to the common, I hear it, I know radical universality. There's some relation between that conversation that was happening. Remember in the contingency with Clow and Butler and now the common. I'll just say, and again, I don't think this answers the question, it's just where I'm starting. I find it weird or something. I just wonder, since Butler wrote, and they know this, wrote the war book, and it's the ontology thing too, the turn to finding what we share first, through universalism, through common, then how it's distributed, then how that creates politics. I can't go there because I understand. It's like if we don't look at what we share, then sometimes I feel like that book is saying, if I can't see in your eyes what I share, a comment, whatever, I kill you? I don't understand it. I don't understand that. So you need to help me because I just am lost with that. And that I think, no, is it indigeneity as a identity? No. Is it something I learned? Yes, so I say that. This is a hierarchy of, for me, Jonto power, in which unless you're like, then there's no ethical, economic, or political stake in me annihilating you. I don't know. I just think, could we do something else other than
Yeah, but you brought up comment.
Well, let me begin with to have a more complex perspective of colonialism. I don't think, well, I don't know. I didn't hear that we were thinking that the colonial is always a metropolis and the otherness is in the margins. I think that all our societies here, the colonial structure in the United States is so clear and how they are racialized and the racialized geographies in this space. So I think that colonialism has marked the life of all of us that are here in this space in very complicated ways. And in that sense, as a scholar and an activist, because I'm also an activist, I start my work with a very deconstructivist perspective of indigeneity. And I have to be like more humble to try to learn what do they mean when they mobilize and why it was meaning for them. Something that for me was so evident that was camisa de fuerza, there was a straight jacket. But why is still being something useful for this woman that I work with? And I didn't have the chance because what I have been writing and been very inspired is with the critique that indigenous women in Latin America have done to the urban-centric feminism. How do we understand emancipation? How do we understand justice? And even the punitive justice, what are the struggles that they have towards those women that are organizing to have the strongest, toughest law against violence, and what are the perspective about those laws? So in that sense, I have been trying to understand why politically is relevant for them and what are they including in this perspective. And what I see is that the material part of this, how do they mobilize from the north to the south? What do they have? Why a woman that was born in Alaska in the ice could have in common with a Mapuche woman in a neighborhood in Argentina? And both are talking about being indigenous woman, and like not the language, not the kind of colonial project, not the kind of, and so what I see how they build and how they have work to build alliance in this and crossing borders, you know, against the carceral state. Or something else that they have in common is how indigenous, what is constructed as indigenous women have been overrepresented on jails. In Mexico, the percentage of women in prison for drugs-related crimes now in the war of drugs is huge, and you can see that in many other areas. So that, because of the experience, how experience informs their theory and their practice, so then it's very evident for many of them that prison is not the solution. That it would probably not be the case for an urban woman that is afraid of crime in a middle class neighborhood in Mexico City and want tougher laws and better prisons, no, for example. So how this experience illuminates them. So just to say that I think just by thinking as a scholar, probably I will have a lot of critiques, mainly with the link between territory and indigeneity, and about authenticity and indigeneity. Those two axes are very problematic. But as an activist, I am very open to see what are they building, what are the contents that they're putting into that, and what are they getting from this content. So it is very interesting how many, in the case of the Enlace, a lot of Chicano women are participating in the Enlace Continental de Mujeres Indígenas. No? They have found a place there, and they are welcome. I mean, and there are women that are in the diaspora in LA, in East LA, and they are participating in the Enlace, no? So how do we? But of course, the discourse of authenticity is always there.
I don't have much directly to say to this, but I wanted to make 3 points because I think they are slightly distantly relevant. The first point is about the binary and the complex expression. I think it's a very important question. I'm a great admirer of the binary, as the starting point. The important thing that we should not forget about the binary, but it should be the right binary. It should not be confusing, it should not obfuscate. Because we must understand something about the fundamental structure of the world and the structure of inequality of wealth, power. That does not mean that the first binary picture is the final picture with which we can either cognitively or practically engage with the world. The world is far more complicated. So my argument would be that we should go through a process of kind of convex conceptualization. Convex in the sense that mathematicians would say that this is one plane, this is another plane, this is a third plane. And if you make a statement which is about all these different planes taken together, they would see that as a convex. So I think in every case of this kind, we should move towards complexity of the, which you are calling complexification. So I think that is very, very important. But I wanted to say something in favor of the binary relationship, and then gradually try to build something which is better. I want to make just two other points, essentially, to tell you what I find very interesting in engaging with Indian, it's not indigenous, in India, indigenous and it is Indian, forms of Indian vernacular political thought. And I would recommend to you two ways of thinking, both of which are derived in a certain sense from older religious thought, but religious thought did not use those concepts to solve these problems. So these people take something from the Gita or Buddhist thinking, and then they mobilize that to think through a problem today. So I'll give you two instances very briefly. One is the Bengali thinker in the 19th century, very deeply Hindu, religious, partially conservative, but he makes a very simple argument, and he says that, of course I'm Hindu, and for me, my Hinduism is very, very important. But I need to think just basically, logically, to realize that if I have a neighbor, and I'll come back to the term neighbor, who is a Muslim or a Christian, his Christianity or Muslimness would be equally important to him or her. Right? So, what we should do is, he also has an argument which I find absolutely fascinating. He thinks that European thought makes a mistake by thinking of connections among people, essentially on lines of blood. And he thinks that blood, beyond the first 2-3 stages, my own family, my kin group, beyond that, blood actually becomes metaphorical. If I say that all Bengalis are linked to me by blood, he would ridicule that. He would say, essentially all Bengalis are linked to you by language, and instead of saying that it is language, you are saying it is blood. All Hindus are related to me by blood. So he thinks that the more you treat the blood argument, it becomes more and more powerful in a certain sense, but it immediately becomes more and more vulnerable if you think about it rationally. So if you do not think in terms of blood, in terms of connection to people who are close to you, who is close to you? Right? The standard answer, not just the European, but also European trained Indian colonial answer is blood in various forms. He says that we should give it up and substitute that by the concept of neighborliness. Either God or nature or history, depending on how you think, and place somebody else next to me as my neighbor. And the very fact that he is my neighbor produces obligation. Right? And we should think about those obligations. And his argument is that instead of trying to define the idea of blood, we should try to define the idea of neighborliness. And we could get a much better theory of social and political belonging through that. And a final point, very quickly, again, religious thought. Many religious thinkers would say that the antonym for self, of course we have to identify the self in order to get into all kinds of things living in the world. Right? The antonym for the self is not always the other. Right? We should not absolutely have the other. So they would say, for example, the Buddhist giants, etc., they would say that Buddhists are very important because Buddhists, they show that in a certain sense you cannot actually even say myself. The person who was born with my birth and who died with my death, that is myself. They would say yourself is your perception of yourself at this moment. Right? What you were 20 years back is not yourself. It's a memory of yourself. Right? Because experience is immediate. So if you take experience as something which is very vital to the notion of the self, then even the self, my own self in this sense, individual self, can be infinitely divided. Because they are also temporal atoms. So they would say that in some sense I myself, but self is a relation, self is not an entity. And so I can apply this relation to a group of people, which I do when I think about my family. Right? So they are people who are close to me, linked to my self-relation. And other people, they are not part of my family, they are not covered by the self-relation. And you can extend this logic to people who speak like me, my language community, my nation, right? All human beings, because they are all prone to suffering and things like that. All animals, because they suffer. All sentient beings, including the vegetable one. And they would say that all beings that exist, including stones and other things, right? So what I find interesting is that, it says that you should use the term self, without which we simply cannot work. But the opposite of the self should not be an other. The opposite of the self should be a non-self, because what is a non-self now? If you change the context of your thinking, will be covered into yourself. And I think the great advantage of that is that if you think like this, then it becomes very difficult. It becomes a little more difficult. I should have said looking at the character of the world today. It becomes a bit more difficult, to visit violence on people who, in one kind of thinking, would be called the other, and therefore deserving of environment. This kind of thinking would say you're non-self in this particular form of thinking, and therefore you should restrain your propensity to violence.
Take another questions, Andreas?
No, I will pass. Thank you.
No?
It's not related to this conversation.
It's a question.
Okay, my question is simple. Here. Very briefly, since we assume or we take as an historical fact that colonialism and capitalism are coevalent, co-original, what does it mean that capitalism is still ruling and colonialism might have been disappearing or disappeared? And that goes back to your categories that the epistemic might be more important than the economic, and I'm thinking that might be the opposite. That's all.
Gary?
I think this is a really productive conversation. And perhaps this might be more sort of reflections coming from Southeast Asia, where the relation to colonialism is again rearticulated in very different ways. I wonder, for one thing, to kind of respond to Professor Mamdani's kind of book, which is, I think there's perhaps to kind of point back to Professor Kaviraj, calling us attention to varieties of colonial experience, whether part of the contention over indigeneity is rooted in precisely different experiences of colonialism. And I would argue, for example, that there's not enough, or perhaps maybe out of my own lack of knowledge, not enough kind of thinking about secular colonialism and its relation to other forms of colonialism. And so, because I would kind of venture to say that secular colonialism is a very distinct formation. If I may be provocative, I would say that if you look at, so I studied the British Empire and law, and look at British imperial jurisprudence, the secular as a colonial form was actually a distinct historical formation that appears and becomes consolidated in the 18th century. And it's a very distinct form that in a sense, is rooted here in the experience of North American colonization, is subsequently reformulated, rearticulated in Australia, Canada, South Africa. But in the rest of Britain, I'm sorry, I have a limited knowledge, and so this is all I can say. In the rest of Britain's empire, the experience of colonialism was different. was in a sense rooted in a response. I mean, in British India is different as well. But I'll just say the colonial office's holdings, that the response, the reconfiguration of colonialism was actually a response to the US Revolution. And subsequently, a turn to a much more authoritarian, a strong distrust of settlers as a form of governance, so on and so forth. So in that sense, like say, I think what I hear from Professor Mandani is like say, look at Africa, look at indirect rule, look at indigeneity as logic of colonial governance. But I think in a sense, like this is precisely what Professor Povinelli said. This is strategy of war, right?
Well, but
Actually, we take one more question and we have a
This is a wonderful discussion. Thank you so much. And I'm really interested in the geography of indigeneity that's coming out here. I work deeply ingrained in the Americas, especially Latin America, and both Latin America and North America. And the similarities with what your work in Australia around is just always astounding. So I wanted to ask Aida, it occurred to me that you stressed the incredible originality of Zapatismo and the moment it created. It was like a watershed moment in indigeneity as a kind of force, and their extroversion was really important. That they saw their movement immediately as global, so they issued invitations to anyone in the world to come to their assemblies, and people did, right? And that kind of extroversion. But it also seemed, my question for you was that Liz talked about the governance of the prior in the original imagining of indigeneity, and it struck me that, and I immediately thought Zapatismo pivoted out of that, out of the governance of the prior. It's not that ancestrality ceased to be important, but it just was totally part of the present. And that's the way it is in indigenous movements today, and indigenous thought today. It's not that you're holding on to a past; it's that you're living a present that is I mean, in the Andes, it's the present is the past being recycled in a certain way. But there's all these. But I was just thinking that maybe I wanted to know if you thought that was right, that Zapatismo made that pivot out of the governance of the prior. And Liz, I wanted to ask you really quickly. You spoke in the very beginning about concepts and where are they coming from and what do we want them to do. And I have been in my book Planetary Longings. There's two Liz's, Povinelli and Gross.
I really, just for the record, I rather you call me Frederick than Liz.
I'm sorry.
No, I don't take offense.
Okay, sorry.
Okay.
Elizabeth,
But that's okay.
Elizabeth Gross, they feel the same other. So there are two Elizabeths, Gross and Povinelli. So Elizabeth Gross talks about concepts in her chapter in Nick of Time. And she says concepts are, what they're there for is to facilitate the imagining of alternative futures, and they always rise with respect to specific problems. And I wondered if you thought that formulation was helpful. And my other question for you was, so in Planetary Longings, I start with the whole idea that there's a millennial pivot from the 90s into the 21st century, the end of the 20th into the 21st. And one of those pivots is a pivot from the post into the geo. And the post is a scholar imagining, looking back and undoing the faulty narratives of the past. And then you flip into the geo, which is the knowledge maker confronting a crisis of futurity. And I keep thinking about when you describe indigeneity, I keep thinking what you've done, what you're doing with it is it's connected in your thought to the geo, which is you bring the geo in. You're one of the main people who brings the geo in as the point of the site of knowledge making. So I'm thinking that your concept of indigeneity kind of almost delinks it from colonialism and hooks it into the geo. But I don't know if that's helpful or I don't know what that's. first. It's on?
I was thinking that with the question of Dr. Andreas Cavivas, that we have like different conversations going on. I don't think colonialism is over. I think that the entire panel has been that colonialism is not over, no? So we're talking about colonial capitalism. So how the capitalism cannot be understood without the colonialism as a structure, no? So I think that in that sense, it's not only epistemic. I was thinking in Eva Took, decolonizing is not a metaphor. It's not just an epistemic movement. It's also epistemic, but it's very, this possession is central to understand how colonial capitalism works. So I think, I know that in the case of India, I'm so bad with names, I'm so sorry. For Professor Kabira, it's very important to think about post-colonial in the sense of the independence of India. But in general, in the case of many of the cases that we have been discussing today, colonialism is not over.
I just ask quickly because in such a case, then it means that the secret of anti-colonialism will be the abolition of capitalism, and maybe this is what we should be discussing. I'm just saying that.
Sorry, I was thinking of the great questions. That would be a good
Yeah.
idea.
To go back to the bullshit.
Could you just re-ask me, because I was restate what you said.
Now,
You say that if the colonialism is part of capitalism, so then we should discuss how to destroy capitalism.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I think many of us agree about that.
okay.
Yes.
Good to
And
know.
I'm sure that Zapatistas and the Enlace Continental de Mujeres Indígenas are trying struggling with that also. And that's it. So I think in that case. And of course, thinking in Mary's Pratt question, I don't think that the issue of ancestrality has been a political issue for the Zapatistas at all. It's always like thinking, how do we build for the future? And the mundo donde quepan muchos mundos, a world where all of us can be there, can have a space. I don't know how to translate mundo donde quepan muchos mundos. Many worlds can fit, a world where many worlds can fit. And it always had been through the outside, so they keep inviting us. And the last time was the trip to Europe, in which they got together with a lot of many anarchist projects, by the way, because there is also a very strong critique to the state as a process. So they went all over the place trying to learn from those experiences and also try to see how can we make those linkage in that sense. So I think that it's an open project for the future. But it is also a project in which the idea of thinking about the self, it is also, I don't want to sound very ontological in that sense, but it's also, in many cases, I was very involved with the case of an indigenous woman that was raped by the army. And she said, it's because what I finish is not the end of my flesh. Who I am is not only my flesh, it's beyond my flesh. So it's also the conception of self that goes also beyond what we imagine as who we are, no? So I think that also there are certain epistemological challenge of how to listen when people are talking about justices in plural, and even to think about the commons. How do we imagine, how do we build this? It is very easy to go to the certainties that we have. And well, I was thinking when she told me this, as a feminist, mi cuerpo es mío, no? It's a slogan that is very important. My body is mine. It's very important for the feminist struggle. And she's telling me that my body, it doesn't end what I imagine where my body ends. So it's first destabilizing to my certainties of how are we communicating. So we are orientalizing, how can we be open to other ways of imagining being in the world and relating with the world, no? And that relates a lot with what kind of demands for justice. For example, the idea of economic justice being so important for the collective, and just thinking about patriarchy in the more traditional sense does not include the kind of economic demands that those women have, or the prison as an option. They say, well, if they put my husband in prison for domestic violence, who's going to work the land? And what good am I going to get that he's in prison? For me, it's a lot better that he can work as a collective punishment for using domestic violence, that he can work the land of my mother who is a widow, just to put as an example. So the prison is not necessarily the solution. So how can we be open to listen to different conceptions of justice and even of personhood that are there, to be able to build alliance, but also to learn another ways of imagining justice and imagining what kind of world do we want to build. So it's, of course, it's anti-capitalist, but how can we, what is the future after capitalism? What kind of world do we want to imagine? Are we willing to open? Because there is also a very strong critique to the civilizatory path that we're taking. So where we are going, and with the idea of development that was present in a lot of the socialist utopias, is criticized very deeply because we are destroying the earth. So what kind of other futures can we imagine? How can we listen to other ways to imagine this world?
Thank you. Yes, I agree. I don't, if I participated in suggesting that I thought colonialism was over, do not. As a matter of fact, it comes back to the conversations in actual indigenous politics and activism over.
Just to make a parenthesis, it's because he said if capitalism.
Yeah, no, I'm gonna get there. Yeah, good, because
If they go together.
If they go together, okay, yes. And I myself always, I don't do structure, superstructure, but if we look at the periodizations of the modality of governance of difference and capital, you know, there's a temporal relation to their movement. Okay, so, but in relation to activist movements, inside of what we would call, you know, what self-described indigenous and allies, even though I know, I hear you, I really do. There's a really big argument about, like, who are indigenous? And a lot of folks, like Holder, I mean, I can talk about academics, Kim Paul there, it's all over, and it's great because it's all over social media, so it's not just like an academic writing, really strong social media arguments about indigeneity. To be indigenous is to be committed to an anti-propertized, anti-capitalist project. And what everybody knows, definitely in the Anglo world, is that the trick was to create borders and territories. And then y'all own it. Now, again, because of my own Povinelli and Barsi history, it's a kind of common, right? It's not private property, but it's property, right? And so once you propertize that, then you can do whatever you want with it. And so the struggle is how to not be propertized. And then what could happen? And so it's not all indigenous people, it's not all indigenous movements, but there is that strong relation to this is an anti-capitalist project. You know, this is something that Natasha Bigfoot, who's a friend of mine, once said to me. She said, you know, you can tell what land is indigenous or been dispossessed. And here she was actually thinking about multiple forms of dispossession, because whenever we say Lattergut, meaning really Europeans in the diaspora, are going to solve the problem of capitalism's inherent toxicity. They're going to solve it now, like the green energy. You see them coming to dig. Wherever they're digging, you could say that's indigeneity. Now that's a very different thing than identity. It's like this land either is where people entangled in these multiple structures of dispossession are living, say, Cancer Alley. So we know the racial component of Cancer Alley. You know where it's been territorialized into bodies and places because that's where they're going to dump the new toxicity to solve their problem, or that's where they're going to dig to create the utopian future. Okay, the future. Again, this might be more Anglo, but the ancestral ongoingness, and I find it. I've been really just moved by what this phrasing is, and at least the worlds I'm in Australia, the conversation. What are you doing now? It goes back to the anti-colonialism. What are you doing now to keep a certain kind of obligation, which is against privatization, going, so that you will be the kind of ancestor that the future wants. It's just really, it's like you will be in the future of the ancestors. So what are you doing now? Right? So it's what kind of temporality, I don't know what kind of temporality that is, because you're the embodiment of an obligation that was handed to you. Are you going to work to keep that obligation going so that you and the more than human world will be looked back on by what you know will be the future?
It's a kind of intergenerational justice.
I think so.
Projected into the future,
Yes.
what do I own to the future generations?
Yeah.
But from the perspective of the future, looking back.
That's right.
Yes.
That's right. But with a somewhat different territorial. I don't want to get rid, because that's really important. Different kind of territorial belongingness in which it's a critique of just the getting up and going anywhere, right? And instead saying, well, if I go, who is here? Maybe that I need to be a neighbor to. Or maybe I have to give up something to be a neighbor. The final thing is that just, yes, concept, I think I'm more like territorial when I think about concepts. It really is, well, if I'm standing here with these folks now-ish, what does this form of governance, or what does it appear as, and what kind of concepts need to be developed to, in a crude way, jam it? I think concept work as from to jam, to make unworkable, without ever thinking that there is a concept, including decolonization, that can lift up out of its territory at the same time, because of the multiple entanglements that started and sedimented. There's going to be some relation between, say, decolonization, geontopower, and other places. It's a material, but maybe other concepts are needed in those other places to do the work. So I also think it's an anti-academic machine, because I think part of, at least, what a lot of the game in the academies is my concept going to be the ruler concept. So I say geontopower, if it works, doesn't, okay, go, work some other concept. Probably has some resonance, but I don't know. Yes, that's it.
You should have a response to this round.
I wanted to mention something responding to you, which is also going back to the response I gave to you earlier. Recently, I was involved in a conversation, written conversation, with James Tully, who wrote a paper which has a much narrower focus on political theory. So his paper was called Deparochializing Political Theory. He did not use the term decolonializing, so he used deparochializing political theory. And when we responded to it, we found that, again, the question of colonialism, and therefore what is decolonizing, broke up at least into three different parts. One was Tami's own work on Canadian indigenous people, which was echoed by somebody called Gary Cooper, who's a Maori theorist from New Zealand. Then Charles Lynn, who passed away 2 years back, he said that slavery is intimately connected to colonialism. So therefore, if you want to decolonize, then you have to take into question of the place of black thinking in the colonial world. And I said that India, the colonialism in India is not settler colonialism in this sense. So the moment you look at something like this, you start with colonial as a single category, but the moment you think about it more historically, it breaks up in your hand, and it doesn't fall apart, but it simply shows the internal divisions, and we have to be sensitive to that.
So I was told by the organizer we have one more final round and one final round. So Carlos and Emma.
Well, yeah, I'm in a somewhat awkward position because I actually waved to him and said no, but I left the room to accompany Mahmoud, and at the time there was remarks about ontology. I come back and I hear remarks about the shift between the post and the geo, and this reminds me of how surrealism began, which is in a language lab. Someone walks in and everybody's blabbing, and of course they all have their headphones, and they can't hear each other, but the person that walks in is like a crazy conversation, and that's the sense that I have walking back in. But now that I was called upon, let me make this question, and perhaps you can help me because I'm stuck, and that is the conversation which with Beth introduced here is the notion of the concept of jamming, and that is somewhat related to what my concern is, and that is that instead of putting this geo versus post versus geo, I'm wondering if we can also think of it used to be the case that everybody was worried about epistemology, getting it right, objectively using the correct methodology. Then came reflexivity. And the idea there is that we don't know, all we can do is, there's a gap between self and object, and we don't occupy the object, we occupy the void between the self and the object. And then now we have this ontology, and what we do is we project ourselves into the object, and we forget there's a void. And I'm wondering, why is that going on? I don't understand ontology. Maybe I'm thick-skulled, perhaps, but what does this say about us?
This is a rather different question. I recently, yesterday, was at a conference, and all of the people coming in were from Australia. And what was really striking to me was how the politics surrounding Gaza articulated in ways that are very, very, very different from the more positive versions of things that are happening here in the US. So obviously, this is not. I mean, so at our campus, for example, or at the campuses across the United States. So one of the things that was made clear to me by those colleagues was that the one-to-one correlation between support for Palestinians is rendered an anti-Semitic articulation in Australia. And so I was curious whether that's been your experience and how that then articulates with notions of solidarity and this frame of indigeneity, because also Australia in some ways, right, like the kind of indigenous claims surrounding land rights, among other things, is very much a part of the popular discourse,
anymore.
Whether or not you
Not we couldn't even pass a voice, a meaningless.
I think we're good. We have
No, so
final
that's
round
that's
of-
it.
yeah.
That's
We can have a final round of responses. We'll start. We have final responses, so start getting go down the.
But maybe that's a question I
No,
put to
that's
all
fine.
three of you in different.
I don't think I have much to say to this round of questions. I just wanted to thank you for wonderful questions which made me think about issues that I wouldn't have thought about otherwise. Thank you.
It's and I just since we're gonna all run away, it has been really productive, and I really thank you guys. I know we're up here. Yeah, I know we're up here. Ah, Carlos, run away. Yeah. Well, yes, that's the question. And I made a mistake of saying geontopower because in geontology, I was trying to say this is an oxymoron. Ontology it's a very complicated field, but has been defined by the finitude ends, right? So disclosure, I love the little Heideggerian disclosure, like the authentic subject is disclosed in relation to finitude the end, right? So that's like how am I? And so that's all for me on the side of life, and then it's more the inert, right? That interests me. That and not even the inert that has no obvious trace of life. So I was trying to say this is a crazy word because ontology is biontology. And so if I use geontology, and I'm trying to point to the weaponization of a complex philosophical tradition that obviously involved language. The whole Subhuda process was all about mind, language, intentionality, all the things that we hold dear in first separating out the European and then separating out the human and all these separations, right? And now, of course, there's a big, but you can just go like this in a discourse and you find just a chunk of discursive junk in your hand around more non-human animals and plants have mind, forests have mind. Can we say rocks have mind? And part of the question I have, and I'm going to get to part of the question I have is, once again, why do we think that we have to give, who's giving it? Why do we have to give mind to everything? Whose mind is this? Where did this mind come from? Where did the obsession about mind come from? Well, it came as they were trying to justify the sadistic use of bodies post-Aztec and Inca bodies, right? Did they have the kind of mind that meant that you couldn't do this or that to these people? That is where the centrality of mind comes in discourses. And now we repeat it. And the way we do it is we say, well, we're going to give this to everybody. Why would a rock want this sadistic colonial mind? I have no idea. Okay, I have no idea. So part of what I've been doing, a lot of my work was, what is this thing, late settler liberalism? What is this? What's this period? How does it function as mode of governance? Blah, blah. What has been interesting, a lot of us, not just me, I'm just one person in this conversation, a lot of people, is what the hell is happening now? And this now is somewhere between 2008, the great recession. The rise of brutal white indigeneity, weaponization, right? And it's, again, depending where you are, it's different. Left version, right versions. But yeah, we too, we have our own roots. The frontal brutality of war. Right? So you can go Caucasus, Syria, Ukraine, you do whatever you want, Gaza, right? In which, oh no, we're not just saying there are always civilian categories. Now notice, civilian is already militarized. Like, leave aside on the Jewish question of the problem with the citizen. Now we're all civilians, i.e. we're already in a military imaginary. And now it's no, I'm showing you and brutalizing civilians. So there's this, like, I feel like we're in that moment, which a lot of people were like, when neoliberalism, what is this? Like, what is this? Part of what is this is our own academic reactions. And so what I'm trying to say gently and lovingly is, what are we doing in the face of the ancestral catastrophe that many people are registering as the coming catastrophe or the arriving catastrophe of climate toxicity, right? As all this is happening with all this other crap, what is going on with the instincts in certain parts of the academy? Why the turn toward ontology? What is that? What is that? Leave aside the technical aspects of the thing. What is that? And this is why I worry about the common, honestly. I get it, but what I worry, maybe it'll help make sense, or I just could be wrong, but what worries me is I think, what does going back to a philosophical base in which you say, first we will describe what existence is, first. Then we'll see that we all share it. Then we can see how it's distributed. Then we can have what is made when we do this. And one of the things that's done when we start with ontology is we say, let's get out of the ancestral ongoingness of this differential dispossession and accumulation, right? Like, I don't have to think about how I am entangled in this. I just can leave it aside for now, right? And there's whole affective stuff going on here. And I can just start with, well, what is? Well, there is what? So I am very interested in it as a racialized and colonial aspect, which once again thinks we can start by not being in something. And then start the analysis. And I say, no. And maybe that's because of, 40 years living with the, the real grind of how do we keep this going? How do we keep this going? What is this?
Well, I just want to go back to gas.
Oh,
yeah.
sorry.
That's all right.
Can I?
Yeah,
go
no,
back?
no.
Yeah. Well, to begin with, I have been the last year at Harvard, so I don't see the same reality that you see in the new school. I have been so impressed of the repression that the students have on how any kind of protest is seen anti-Semitic. It was, I was very surprised, so I don't know what is going on in Australia and how do you contrast with what is going on here, but just the doxing against our students that had happened with all these huge screens, and the professors didn't want to even sign to defend their own students from the doxing. That was something that I was so surprised. So I don't see like a positive, I see a lot of repression. Well, Claudine Gay is gone. And I was in the celebration when she became the first Afro-American woman to be a president. And there was a huge celebration with Haitian music. And a few months later, she was gone with these higher hearings that were terrible. So for me, I'm very impressed, even coming from a country where there is a lot of a history of political repression. I could not imagine this context. It has marked my experience in the US. So I see a lot of the use of anti-Semitism as a discourse to repress and to silence people. I don't know how it's here in this specific space, but in Boston, it's terrible.
Oh,
People
yeah.
are afraid, they don't want to send letters, they don't even want to defend their own students. Now in the camping, the professors of Harvard are not in the camping, not even outside the camping. The students are by themselves there, and they will have terrible consequences. I'm sure that see what happened with Claudine Gay, this will happen to these students, and I don't see the professors at Harvard doing a lot to defend their own students. I don't know how.
Yeah, sorry, just to be clear, it was more that it sounds like things are even worse in Australia.
Oh, okay. I
And
thought you were
was
saying it was
interested in what-
better. I was
No,
like,
no, and what indigenous groups, how they're thinking about their anyway, sorry, that was.
And just to close, and of course, UNAM in Mexico, well, it's something totally different. I mean, there are some people, of course, that can resist, but now it's a huge movement of in support of Palestine at UNAM, and the scholars are very involved. They have created a webpage. They were able to do an exchange program with the students of Diversity University in Ramallah. And the students, even when they don't speak English, in the case of Mexico, they have an exhibition, a beautiful exhibition that was done by both the students at UNAM and the students at Ramallah. So they did it virtually, and they took it down and they put it in the walls there. So I see that there's more. Of course, there's a very strong Jewish conservative community there, but also a very progressive Jewish community in Mexico that is mobilizing in this movement for support for Palestine. There's this woman, I'm so bad with name, Rabino, you know her name? Was a theologist, is a Jewish theologist, and she has been very active in the movement. So I see a huge contrast between Harvard and Mexico right now.
So just want to thank our panelists again for being with us for this amazing conversation. But also more broadly thanking all of you for being with us for this conversation over the last 2 days. It's been really strong experience for me as mostly an outsider. And on that note, I really wanted to end this before we move to a reception by thanking Carlos, Jochen, Udeepta, and me for their enormous amount of work that goes on behind the scenes.